So to start off the season, we have our own Ryan Tom, who is not only translational neuroscience in one man, but also known for his creative presentations. So we thought he would be setting a good standard for the rest of the season.
Okay.
All right, over to you, Ryan.
All right, thank you everyone for joining today and those on Zoom. I guess if you have any questions, pop it in the chat and I'll try to answer it later on. Yeah, I've been asked to try to be a little bit creative, so I might have some creative parts throughout the talk. So I just ask that you try to play along. The goal is just to kind of have a good time, and for all of us from different fields, from doing more maybe basic science in rodents, some rodent research, to cognitive neuroscience, to clinicians, to all be able to get together and have some crosstalk. So. Yeah. Okay, there we go. So this is the medicine wheel, which is a First Nations kind of look at mental health. So I'd like to start off with acknowledging that we're on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm thankful to be doing what I'm doing here on this land of the unceded territories. I am personally Cree. My family's Cree or Nihiya from Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, but I grew up in Kamloops on the traditional territory of the Secwepemc people. And mental health has always been important to me because my grandma went to residential school and she faced challenges with anxiety. My mother also was highly anxious. Many Indigenous people, like a lot of people in general, grapple with depression or anxiety throughout their lifetime. And so I always had a draw towards mental health and wellness. I initially came to UBC because I wanted to be a clinical, clinical psychologist. I thought I could help my community out in that way. Then I started taking more neuroscience courses. I took actually Stan Floresco here in the audience here, and I started really liking neuroscience. And I thought, well, maybe I could go into behavioral neuroscience and really understand mental health and wellness. So I started to do that, and I started to work with animals. I did a lot of looking at local steroids in the brain and how that affected executive function. But then after my master's, I decided I wanted to get some cognitive neuroscience research, so to go back into doing some human type of research. And connecting, so all this research that we're doing in animals, how does that actually impact the human condition that we're trying to study? And so that's kind of brought upon a lot of the translational research that I'm trying to do. Now that I'm coming close to finishing my PhD, I went to a workshop recently in Montreal in cultural psychiatry, and I wanted to look at the impacts of how culture and society might be impacting things like mental health. And so I've kind of come full circle around. I've learned all these different areas from different levels of analysis, from looking at rodents and brains into humans and behavior and fMRI to now cultural psychiatry, but all with the same thread of thinking about how can I help my community in some way to understand mental health and wellness better. And so I really do have an understanding in terms of people in different fields. This idea of crosstalk, trying to talk across to different people, it can be overwhelming because there's different terminology, different languages. And so, so I understand that. So I just hope that everyone comes together and kind of puts up with each other and the different ways of talking to start off with, to hopefully build something where we can kind of talk across each other and start to understand one another. So one of the things that I want to look at is, as I was alluding to, is depressive and anxiety disorders. So depressive and anxiety disorders are highly comorbid. Depression and anxiety disorders have increased globally. Worldwide, depression is one of the most disabling disorders in terms of years lived with the disease. And depression is strongly associated with suicide and non-suicidal behavior. And there's a high lifetime prevalence of these disorders, between 16 and 28%. So now I'm going to go more into the meat of my talk. And But even though we know all these things about depression and anxiety, we don't really understand the etiology of these disorders. It's very limited. We might have a diagnosis, but it might not predict whether you'll respond to a certain medication. And depressive and anxiety disorders are highly comorbid. A lot of patients who are struggling with these disorders have co-occurrent anxiety. And there's an increased risk in this group of treatment resistance, increased recurrence rates, and increased suicide ideation, suggesting that maybe there's some subtypes of depression. A lot of research has focused on these pure diagnostic categories, but is this really generalizable when you look at a lot of the patients who are typically having comorbid depression and anxiety? So this has led to the development of the Research Domain Criterion Initiative, which looks to understand and to create closer links between preclinical animal research and human psychiatric disorders. And if you look at the picture on the left, you see that there's all these different levels of analysis, from genes to molecules to cells to circuits, physiology, behavior, and self-report. And so each of us, whether we're clinicians or preclinical animal researchers, we can all add something to a different level of understanding these disorders. And again, to reiterate, I think the crosstalk between us is really important. So one of the goals is to focus on dysfunction within neural circuits and look at observable measures of behavior to add on to these self-report measures. And to take a transdiagnostic approach too, that some symptoms might be shared across disorders. So I'm going to talk a lot about avoidance and reward-seeking behaviors. And why am I choosing this? Well, a lot of depression and anxiety symptoms are characterized by impairments in reward-related processing. And these processes are regulated by corticolimbic striatal dysfunction. And avoidance and reward-seeking behaviors, these circuits are recruited, and so it might be important to understand if we are to understand depression and anxiety better. Anxiety symptoms are usually characterized by persistent or excessive avoidance behaviors. And avoidance and reward-seeking behaviors, as I said, are regulated by these circuits. Depression and anxiety show abnormalities in these circuits. So putting all these together, it's really important to study reward-seeking and avoidance, and to look at how does avoidance occur in depression? How does reward-seeking affect anxiety disorders? And what happens when they're comorbid, when they co-occur? So now we're going to play a game. I want you all, so this is a little hatching turtle. I want you guys all to close your eyes, okay? And I want you to imagine yourself as a hatching turtle on the beach, and you're just coming out to see the world for the first time. How do you feel? What do you see? Keep your eyes closed. I want you guys to really feel this. Now, as you walk onto the beach, you want to go to the water. How are you feeling as you're walking towards the water? You hear the ocean waves. You're getting closer and closer. How do you feel now? You feel a bird flying overhead. You take a deep breath because it could mean death. You don't make it. Now open your eyes. So here is a common response in terms of survival, right? The turtle needs to make it to the ocean. And even when it makes it to the ocean, it might not survive. But there's this bird flying overhead. And this cue, the caw, right, is a cue that, what do you do in that scenario? Do you run and boot it for the water? Do you try to take an active avoidance kind of response to go to the water to escape? Or do you take more of an inhibitory? You might hide and try not to move so you're not detected by the bird. So there's different strategies that we might use as if we're a baby turtle, but we also use this as humans in everyday life. You might imagine that you're in a class, let's say, and there's someone that you really don't want to see that you found out that is in the same class as you. And so you could take an active avoidance approach and maybe register into a new section, Or you might just take an inhibitory avoidance approach, and you might, try to avoid eye contact or not being seen by them within that. And so in depression and anxiety, this is common that we use these different strategies. So that's the, sorry. Okay, so now I wanted to assess whether depressive and anxiety levels are predictive of active and inhibitory avoidance performance in a non-clinical sample. So we're doing this in close work with a bunch of collaborators, and that's why the task that I'm going to show you is really trying to model off what Stan Floresco does with his preclinical animal research. As I said, we're trying to create these closer links. So we've been in talks with Stan Floresco to really try to, as closely as possible, try to translate the task that is done in rodents into humans. And then on the other side, we collaborate with Dr. Trisha Chakrabarty, and she's a psychiatrist here at UBC who studies mood disorders. And so we're looking from her feedback from the clinical side of things. And here in the middle is me and my supervisor, Dr. Rebecca Todd, and we're doing this cognitive neuroscience kind of in between this translational sandwich. So if we want to go from bench to bedside, and we need everyone along the way. And so what we're doing is we're doing research trying to look at active avoidance and active and inhibitory avoidance in a non-clinical sample, but looking at active and depressive symptoms. And so how do rodent studies study active and inhibitory avoidance? So a rodent might be in an operant chamber, and for active avoidance, it might get a cue. And then once it hears that cue, it learns that if it presses this lever, then it can avoid a shock, and it would get a safety signal. However, when it hears this cue, if it doesn't press that lever to avoid, then it gets shocked, and usually it can escape that shock by pressing the lever after that, and then it would get a safety signal. However, if the rodent fails to respond to the cue and press the lever, it would get shocked, and that would be an active avoidance failure. So this is how they study active avoidance in rodents. How about inhibitory avoidance? So for inhibitory avoidance, it might hear another cue. And for this cue, it has to withhold that active avoidance response in order to successfully avoid. And it would get a safety cue, and it would successfully have inhibitory avoidance. However, if the rodent presses up the lever during the inhibitory avoidance cue, then it would fail and it would receive a foot shock. So this is how it's studied. So there's active avoidance, you can avoid, you can escape, or you can fail. For inhibitory avoidance, you can avoid or fail. And this is how they're studied in rodents. And we know a lot about the neural circuitry of what the brain regions that are involved in regulating these behaviors because of the work that Stan Floresco has been doing. So taking that task in mind, we wanted to back translate this into humans. So we made a task where they learned where participants could learn active avoidance response to start with through trial and error, similar to how rodents would. And then we introduced an intermixed task stage where now they learned active and inhibitory avoidance, as you can see indicated by the green and red lines. And then we also wanted to do a reversal stage so where we switched the cues that signal the type of response required to avoid to see if there was any type of problems in terms of behavioral flexibility. So we wanted to look at three different aspects: the learning, the acquisition of active avoidance, the intermix, the ability to flexibly interchange active and inhibitory avoidance strategies, and then the flexibility when things change, are you able to update and change your behaviors? So it's similar to what Stan did, but modified a little bit. And for active avoidance, what a participant might see on screen is they might get this cross on screen to start a trial, and then a cue would appear on screen to signal the type of response required. In this case, it would be active avoidance, and it would be a blue circle. And then the participants here must press multiple times in order to successfully avoid. And so if they did this in the requisite amount of presses within their allotted time, then they would receive a safety signal, similar to the rodents. However, if participants didn't press the requisite number of times or didn't press at all, then they would hear an aversive noise. Now, I don't know if those of you on Zoom could have heard that, but it's a really aversive noise that participants do find motivating to want to avoid. Similarly, for inhibitory avoidance, a participant would see a different shape, like a square, and they would have to withhold a press. If they did this successfully, they would receive a safety signal. However, on these trials, if they made an active response, then that would be a failure, and they would hear another aversive noise. So this is how we tried to model the rodent task in humans using a computer-based online task. Now here's just a video depicting what it might look like from the participant's perspective. On the top is a video that is showing the button presses. So the participant would see that this is just for illustration purposes, so that you can see. And then a shape will appear on screen. It doesn't show active avoidance normally on the bottom, but this is just to illustrate the type of trial. So I'm going to press play, and then you can watch to see how quick it comes to you. You can see I was pressing, and then I had to press. There I failed to press, so I failed. That was a successful inhibitory avoidance strategy. And there I pressed, so then I failed. So, it kind of happens quickly, and so you can kind of get the feeling of the sense of what it's like from the participant's perspective. Oh, now I was going to play later. So we assessed this in an online task. We recruited 465 undergraduates and online workers, undergraduates from UBC and online workers from Prolific. And they were recruited to perform this task. And then, like I said, this was a reverse translation of the rodent operant task. And then to assess depressive and anxiety levels, we used the Beck Depression Inventory and the Beck Anxiety Inventory, respectively. And so here are some of the results. I'm first going to go over some of the levels of depressive levels, and anxiety levels. So here on the left side, you can see on the x-axis is the BDI score. So this is the depressive scale. And this has been standardized because we had to remove a question for ethics purposes, because there was a suicide ideation question, and we didn't want to trigger participants when we're not around to be able to give them the proper help. So we normalized everything so that way it's a proportion of the max score that they could have possibly done. So on the bottom, it goes from 0 to 1. So 1 would have been the maximum possible score. And to make it easy for you, I put what cutoffs would be in the literature from minimal, mild to moderate to severe. So that way, those of you who are clinicians can kind of get a sense, since it's not in the raw scale format. And then you can see that this is the density, and it's split by undergraduates and online workers. And what you can notice is that the mean is depicted by the dashed lines there. The mean is in the mild to moderate range. So there's a range of depressive levels in the participants, with a lot of them scoring actually mild to moderate to even severe. So we have a sample that has a good wide range, so that would be useful for studying. But as you can see that, a lot of people, as discussed earlier, can have high levels of depressive and anxiety symptoms. For anxiety levels, the same thing for comparison purposes. The x-axis is a proportion of the maximum score. And then again, minimal, mild to moderate to severe. And you can see that, again, people on average are scoring in the mild to moderate range. And there was a significant difference between undergraduates and online workers, with undergraduates having a higher level of anxiety levels. Now, we wanted to also see if there was any sex differences. And so we looked at depressive levels by sex. We also looked at gender as well, how people identified in their gender. And there was often a lot of overlap with this. However, for other identifications, we didn't have enough power to say anything. So we're only showing for today just by sex, so female and male. And what we see is that there is a significant difference in depressive levels between females and males, with females having higher levels of depressive levels. And similarly, there was a significant difference between males and females in anxiety levels, with females having higher levels. So now looking at the acquisition task stage. So during the acquisition stage, this is where they had to learn through trial and error to make an active avoidance response. And you can see that, participants learned to make the active avoidance response, and they performed about a level of that. And you can see here a learning curve in terms of over the course of blocks of trials throughout the acquisition stage, how they learned over time. Similarly, during the intermixed task stage, now participants must flexibly guide their behavior between active avoidance and inhibitory avoidance to avoid the unpleasant noise. And you can see here that participants more readily perform inhibitory avoidance than active avoidance in this. And you can see also the learning of inhibitory avoidance over the course of the intermixed task stage. And then for the reversal task stage, again, you see a difference between active and inhibitory avoidance, and how they early on, when the contingencies changed, they had to relearn the new contingencies. So we also want to look at a multi-level model, looking at depressive levels, and to see if the Beck depression inventory, if sex, task stage, and the sample would predict active avoidance performance. And similarly for inhibitory avoidance, we wanted to see if anxiety could predict inhibitory avoidance performance, while also accounting for sex, task stage, and sample. And we did the same with anxiety, so using the Beck anxiety inventory. And what we found for active avoidance is that there was a significant negative relationship between depressive levels on active avoidance proportion correct. So meaning that the higher that participants scored in depressive symptoms, the poorer their performance on active avoidance tended to be poorer at performing active avoidance. However, we found out that there was a significant BDI by sample interaction. So there was a significant difference in terms of this relationship between undergraduates and online workers, where in undergraduates, this negative relationship was there. However, there was no relationship in online workers. And those regression lines are significantly different. So yeah, depressive levels were inversely related to active avoidance performance in undergraduates, but not online workers. Looking at anxiety levels, we also we found that there was a near significant relationship between anxiety levels and active avoidance performance. And when we looked at the interaction of sample, there was a significant interaction of sample again. We find that that there was a significant difference between the samples. So again, there seems to be a trend, at least in this case for anxiety levels, towards a negative relationship between anxiety levels and active avoidance performance. And this relationship was significantly different between samples. We also looked at inhibitory avoidance. So on the left side here, you see this is depressive levels, and we didn't see a significant relationship with the depressive levels and inhibitory avoidance performance. And there was no difference between the samples in inhibitory avoidance. And similarly for anxiety levels, there was no significant relationship or interaction with anxiety levels on inhibitory avoidance performance. So that kind of led us, well, what's driving these sample differences in the relationship between depressive levels and anxiety levels on active avoidance performance? So we want to look at what was the differences between the samples. And so instead of running our multi-level model looking at sample, we wanted to do it looking at age. So we just swapped out age and to see if this would show a similar type of effective sample. And because indeed we do see in this that there was a significant difference in age between the samples. As you can see, the undergraduates were far more, their distribution was far more centralized around a younger age, whereas online workers was more distributed in a higher age. So when we did this, we did find that there was a significant interaction between depressive levels and age. And what you see on the right side is the mean age, -1 standard deviation in age, and +1 standard deviation in age. And so at -1 standard deviation, which would be young, more replicating the undergraduate sample, you find that there was this negative relationship. And as you go up in age, so going to the mean or going, and this is in the full sample, going to the mean age or to +1 standard deviation of age, this relationship decreases. So age differences between undergraduates and online workers may be driving the different relationships observed during between depressive levels and active avoidance performance. And similarly, we did the same thing with anxiety levels, and we found the same pattern. So modeling the interaction of sample and instead of sample, switching out for age, and we see this significant interaction where at younger ages, there seems to be this negative relationship between anxiety levels and active avoidance performance. And as you go up in age to the mean level of age and 1 standard deviation above, then this relationship decreases. So because we found a significant difference in active avoidance in the undergraduate sample, we wanted to look at by separating the undergraduate sample into different groupings depending on their symptoms. Again, thinking about this idea of comorbidities that I talked about at the beginning. And so if you see on the x-axis, there's 3 different groups: low, high depth, which means high depression, high angst, which means high anxiety, and high. High would be high depression, high anxiety together. So you'd think of that as like a comorbid group, and low would be like the control group. So during the acquisition task stage, we didn't see a significant difference in undergraduates for active avoidance, although there does appear to be a trend towards a decrease in active avoidance performance in the comorbid group. For the intermixed task stage, we did get an overall significant effect. And when we do a follow-up analysis, it looks like there was a significant difference between high depression and high anxiety in terms of active avoidance performance in the undergraduate sample. And in the reversal task stage, there was no difference between the groups. So we just wanted to kind of do a follow-up. This didn't necessarily turn anything up in terms of groupings. It might be better actually to think of modeling these, instead of trying to put these categories on people, is to look at it more as the distribution with the multi-level model. But this is just informative to kind of follow up on. So in summary, inhibitory avoidance is more readily performed compared to active avoidance. There was a negative relationship between depressive and anxiety levels and active avoidance performance, but only in the undergraduate sample. And the relationship between depressive and anxiety levels and active performance might decrease with age, it appears. So there's a few outstanding questions. What type of response, action versus inhibition, is more readily performed in a reward-seeking context? What is the relationship between depressive and anxiety levels and active and inhibitory reward-seeking performance? And does depressive and anxiety levels predict response differences between motivational contexts? So for instance, active reward-seeking versus minus active avoidance performance. And you'll kind of see a little bit about this in the next few slides, what I mean. So now I want you to close your eyes again. Okay, and it's, it's winter time, it's all cold, and you're starting to get hungry. I've been rambling on a little bit long. You're maybe thinking what you're gonna have for dinner, and you're gonna cook this nice ramen. You're cooking this nice ramen, it's getting nice and hot, and you've been waiting for so long, you put it into the bowl, and you can smell it. But it's piping hot. It just finished cooking. Now, what do? Do you want to enjoy it? Do you inhibit trying to eat it right away? And then so that way you can actually enjoy the flavor of it without getting your tongue burned? Or, do you take an active, maybe reward-seeking response and maybe you put some ice cubes in it to cool it down quicker? So these are some things so you can open your eyes now. So this is an example of maybe, active reward-seeking and inhibitory reward-seeking. And so we want to also assess this. However, we want to assess this within subjects because there's some evidence showing that that in depression or major depressive disorder, we always think of it as changes in blunted reward related processing, and in anxiety disorders we think of it as this increased maintenance of avoidance behaviors. Well, what happens when you can assess both active and inhibitory avoidance and reward seeking within the same individual? And we want to see perhaps there might be differences in the subtypes of depression or the relationship of depressive and anxiety symptoms on these different behaviors. Oh, not doing it again. Okay, so for this task, it's very similar to the other task. So we have an acquisition task stage and then an intermixed task stage. We didn't have a reversal task stage this time because there's going to be 4 different trials. So you'll see 2 different shades of green there in the acquisition. So one represents active avoidance trial and the other represents an active reward-seeking trial. And then similarly for the red shades, you'll see 2 different shades. There's one that represents inhibitory avoidance trial and an inhibitory reward-seeking trial. And so similarly, you have the same shapes, and I won't go through the whole procedure again. However, we just add in 2 different cues, and instead of having to make an active avoidance response, let's say to avoid some unpleasant sound, here you're making active responses to get a reward. In this case, it was points towards a monetary reward. And then similarly for inhibitory, you have to inhibit to gain a monetary reward. So that's what it looks like. So for this study, we recruited 293 participants, and they were just undergraduates this time because we found only our effect in undergraduates in the first task. We decided to focus just on undergraduates for now. Not that, age will be important, maybe age would be important in this, but we just wanted to focus in on undergraduates. And then again, we used the Beck Depression Inventory and Beck Anxiety Inventory to assess depressive and anxiety levels. So here are some of our results. So again, so you see this very narrow range of age in our undergraduate sample, which is good for controlling, in rodents, typically when you do a study in rodents, they're all the same age, right? So that's also another thing that I would say, doing human research that I might offer to some of the behavioral neuroscience or preclinical researchers is that they often narrow down their age, and maybe there's different developmental trajectories. Here I found it in an age that might be more closely resembling your population that you might test in, young adult rats. But maybe there's differences across the life trajectories. So that's something to keep in mind. And then so depressive levels, again, in the sample, you can see that they were in the mild to moderate range. And then similarly for anxiety levels, so similar to the previous sample. And then separating by sex again, we see a trend towards a sex difference in depressive levels, where females are higher in depressive levels than males. And it's important to note that the male sample is quite small. So maybe that if it was larger or equal, you might not see that. But anxiety levels, this is similar as the previous sample where you see this start significant difference in anxiety levels. Okay, so looking at the acquisition task stage. So this is where they acquire both active avoidance and active reward seeking. So on the left side, where with the green triangles, you can see that is active reward seeking, and on the right side is active avoidance. And on the y-axis is the proportion correct or successful. And so you can see that there's a significant difference between active reward seeking and active avoidance performance during the acquisition. So this is interesting because they're seeing the exact, it's counterbalanced, they're seeing the same shape, they're making the exact same action. You think that, they would have the exact same performance on both, but you don't see this. So it appears that the motivational context is important in terms of, in an avoidance context, it's much harder to perform an action than in a reward-seeking context where you're more readily prepared to perform an action. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. If you compare the proportion correct in this mixed design, with the proportion correct when all they were learning was the avoidance, did you get around the same percent proportion correct on the active avoidance here as you do in the other study?
No, it's on the other study it was around 0.8, I think, but it's because it's multiple cues too, so it's a little bit more difficult. With the avoidance one, there's just 2 cues, so it's kind of a little bit easier. With this one, once you get into the intermixed task stage, it's actually tough to start off with to keep track. Yeah.
So the other hand would be that, let's say, people active avoidance could have been higher than here. I guess you can.
Yeah, and active reward seeking would still be higher, probably, you know, potentially if I just looked at reward seeking. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I thought it might just pull them all up, so that you still find it harder to actively avoid, but you do better than if you didn't reward seeking inside it. But it looks like the opposite is true.
Yeah.
Actually, reward seeking.
Yeah. And then for the intermixed task stage, so this is where you're doing both active inhibitory avoidance and reward seeking. So on the left side, underneath active, you see the exact same pattern as in the acquisition. So that's good. It shows that it's the same pattern. So active reward seeking in the green triangles is much more readily executed in a rewarding context than in an avoidance context where performance is lower. And then if you look at the inhibitory bars on the right side, you can see that the opposite is true in the avoidance context. So in the avoidance context, in the red circles, you're much more readily prepared to inhibit a response than in a reward-seeking context. So you can see that performance is lower for inhibitory reward-seeking compared to inhibitory avoidance. And then similarly, if you look at there's a significant difference, again, which is matching the previous study where inhibitory avoidance is higher than active avoidance. But in the reward-seeking context, you don't see it, so it's not significant. So between the 2 triangle bars, there's not a significant difference there. So they're performing similarly for active and inhibitory reward-seeking. So that's cool. It kind of suggests that potentially this motivational context could even this idea, there's a lot of research showing this Pavlovian influence over instrumental behaviors. And so there might be this Pavlovian response in terms of, you know, that you're in this aversive context, or you know that you're in this appetitive or reward-seeking context that might change your ongoing behavior. So in the aversive context, if you think about it, you know, oftentimes people think of these species-specific kind of reactions where you might freeze to something, right? Or, you know, that fight or flight kind of response. And what you notice is in the avoidance context, it's easier to maybe, and it's harder to overcome an active response in an avoidance context. Okay? And then so I try to do a multi-level model, so I'm still working on getting the figures for that and getting the data for looking at the effect of BDI and BAI on these different trial types. But I do, initially it looked like there was actually no effects that I found. So that was interesting and that was different than the first study. But I also wanted to look at these different scores. So, you know, the difference between for active avoidance versus active reward seeking, you can see on the left side in the green, there's quite a difference there. And there's a difference between inhibitory as well. So I was thinking that, you know, looking at the effect of basically motivational context on these actions, and if I look at the difference score on this for each individual, you know, some individuals might score similar, some might have more negative scores, some might have more positive. And so looking at that, maybe that will be, maybe depressive and anxiety levels will be able to predict how they have these different scores. And so that's kind of what I find here a little bit. So this is, there was a significant effect of BDI. Again, this is all preliminary stuff. Take all this data with a grain of salt because I'm still working on it. This is just very preliminary stuff. But there was a negative relationship on BDI scores and the different scores. So I did active reward seeking minus active avoidance in this case. And so interpreting that and understanding that will be interesting. And same thing with the BAI. So you see a similar effect. So again, preliminary results, take this all with a grain of salt. But I do think that this idea of Pavlovian influence on instrumental behavior could be important in understanding this. So in summary, active reward seeking is more readily performed compared to active avoidance. And in an avoidance context, action versus inhibition is significantly different. However, the difference between actions is not observed in a reward-seeking context. And modeling the relationship between depressive levels and anxiety levels on avoidance and reward seeking is currently ongoing. And this leads me to my last idea. So I was also, as I was thinking about this, reading papers about the Pavlovian influence on active avoidance performance only. And they did find that there was this Pavlovian influence on instrumental behavior and generalization of behavior. So when you think of Pavlovian fear conditioning, oftentimes in, like, let's say PTSD, you think of this overgeneralization of stimuli. So you might have been at war, maybe, and you know, you had one of those, what are they called, IEDs, and you know, so you had this explosion, maybe you had a friend die, you come back home and then you see you know, a cue on the road that, you know, doesn't necessarily look like it, but it's like that, and then it might, you know, put you into a panic attack. So you're generalizing the stimuli, you're no longer in that context, or it looks completely different, but, you know, it may be similar in some cases, but different, and you have this overgeneralization. And so there's these papers showing this, that this Pavlovian influence could have overgeneralization in instrumental behavior as well. And so I wanted to make another task to follow up on this, so having the exact same acquisition and intermixed task stage. The only difference is we have a cognitive bias stage. And so you can see interspersed between active and inhibitory or go and no-go trials, and this is all in avoidance. We have these bias probes where we'll put, so this, in this case, I'll show you a representation. For active avoidance, someone might see a white circle and have to make those responses. For inhibitory avoidance, you might see a black circle. For a bias probe, you're going to get something in between. And we're going to see, how do you respond to this when you see something ambiguous for the first time? You know, are you going to take an active avoidance strategy, or are you going to take more of an inhibitory avoidance strategy? And so what we did is we parametrically adjusted the grayness between white and black over the course of the task stage. So if you look at, again, the top task stage, the colors kind of change to be more closer to the inhibitory cue, so more closer to black as the trial progresses. And so we wanted to see, well, at what point do people start treating it like active avoidance? And then, you know, at some point do they flip? Because what we do is that during the bias probe, no matter what response you do, you're always going to end up in safety. So you can make an action, you can withhold an action. It's always going to be safety. So it's really just how are you acting to this novel stimulus, this new stimulus, for the first time, even though there's never been any type of outcome associated with it. And so this is just, again, pilot data. So we're just trying to get the task up and going to run into a larger sample. But over the course of the bias block, so this is just looking at the bias trials. So the trials that were the ambiguous ones, going from left to right. And then, so this is the mean number of key presses. And so you do see that early on, they press more and they make multiple presses, which is treating it similar to an active avoidance type of trial. And it goes down over the course of the bias block. So there's a lot of, and so we went from being closer to active avoidance to inhibitory avoidance. What we might do in another version is we might flip it and go from inhibitory avoidance to active avoidance. And what this is kind of suggesting to me is potentially your early experience with these kind of generalization cues might kind of, you know, keep invigorating your ongoing behavior in terms of how you avoid. So your first actions were, okay, I made an active response and I'm getting safety. So I'm going to keep doing that. Better be safe than sorry. And so if I flip it around and do from inhibitory to active, then we might see a different response where early on they're treating it more like inhibitory, and they might be like that for the whole stage. So this is another thing. Again, this is pilot data. We're going to run this in a larger sample and do the exact same type of analyses as we did in the first two tasks. And so that's it. And I want to end off by saying that, you know, I'm just doing one part. So, you know, we're looking at different cognitive performance on tasks in humans. But, you know, there's really a complex system going on here. And as I said, as I come full circle around all the different research, I'm doing animal work to cognitive work, and now I might go into doing cultural psychiatry work, looking at cultural and societal influences on mental health. you know, there's this interplay of a complex system that all, and we're only looking at one snapshot. And that's why we need everyone from clinicians to behavioral neuroscientists to cognitive neuroscientists, because in order to understand this, we're only looking at one little piece, and we need everyone's levels of analysis.